Chapter 1. The wheel turned beneath the condemned's tied shoulders as the foreman barked, "Hold him steady." Fear sits in the condemned's hands, a concrete heat that makes his fingers clench the rope. He breathes against the rope, and fear shapes every small movement he can still make. The crowd pushes forward along the slope. The narrator records and measures what happens next, not as sermon but as ledger. This is the central problem. The ritual has been arranged to stretch life into spectacle rather than to quicken death. The condemned is 35, gaunt, and wrapped in soiled linen. The documentary narrator notes his age from the list of indictments and a bailiff's tally, then watches the foreman test a hammer head with a sharp metallic ring. The foreman is named Gerin, the senior executioner is called Havel. Gerin checks bindings, Havel rubs oil on an iron head, and the narrator's voice stays steady while listing technical details. Within these first moments the stakes are clear. Whether the town will treat punishment as an instrument of order or as a paid performance depends on choices made between Gerin and Havel. Gerin steps closer and speaks as if inspecting livestock, feet first, then the arms. Gerin says, "Keep him alive until the bell tolls twice." Havel replies, "He will not die before we finish if you pay me well." The exchange changes the scene from chaotic cruelty to organized choreography. The narrator writes the exchange down and records the exact sequence Gerin prescribes. The condemned's breathing tightens. His face goes pale and then flushed in opposing waves. That change, fear into flinching into a sudden attempt at speech, drives him to reach toward the child in the crowd later, and it changes how witnesses respond. The hill is packed with townspeople leaning on staves and crates. A cleric stands with his hands folded but not closed. Several guards shift weight from foot to foot. The wheel, heavy as a cart axle, rests on a wooden stand with ropes coiled like slow snakes. The narrator notes the stand's construction, the iron fittings, the ring marks where ropes have worn the wood smooth. Every bolt is catalogued because each bolt marks a choice, mercy or spectacle. Havel lifts the first hammer with a practiced motion and lays its head against the condemned's shin. He hesitates a fraction longer than his hand requires. The condemned flinches and tries to meet Havel's eye with a look that is not surrender but an attempt to understand why this fate is exacted upon him. The narrator hears the condemned whisper, "Why me?" The question is small and human. Havel replies without gentleness. "You know why?" That answer contains a civic decision the chapter must track. The community's appetite for visible, procedural cruelty. Gerin examines the wheel's spokes as if reading a map. He traces the rim with a finger and speaks aloud the order of blows. Left foot, left arm, right arm, 2 hits per limb, then a pause. "Turn him before the spine." His voice is low, deliberate. Havel repeats the sequence and slaps the first blow. The sound cracks against the hill and draws a reflexive gasp from the crowd. The narrator records timing. 1 swing, 2 swings, then the pause that preserves consciousness. The procedure is methodical. The crowd leans into that method, trading instinct for expectation. The first wave of blows breaks bone in a way the narrator can identify by sound and by the animalized jerk in the condemned's torso. The condemned tries to cry out, but the rope at his throat stops a full shout. He manages a hoarse syllable, and then a string of breath, hitched whining sounds. Havel's strikes are measured. Gerin counts softly, aloud, 3, 4, hold, Gerin says. The condemned's knees buckle, but the straps keep him aligned. The narrator notes the specific tools used. A flat-faced hammer, wedges, a leather-bound strap to lock the limb. These details matter because they show intention. A boy in the front row watches with wide, wet eyes and presses a wooden toy against his chest. The condemned turns his head and fixes that boy with a thread of attention. For a moment he is lucid enough to speak. "Child," he says, voice raw, "done tell them I was their neighbor." The boy's mother pushes him back harder against the crate. Someone curses. That small exchange fractures the crowd's collective appetite into private discomfort for a handful of people. The narrator writes the boy's age into the log and notes the mother's hands shaking. Outside, the immediate shoves and blows, institutional threads pull taut. A town magistrate stands apart with parchment in hand and watches as if confirming that the spectacle matches the written sentence. A cleric murmurs a prayer that is more habit than conviction. Their presence shifts weight away from spontaneous violence to sanctioned brutality. The foreman, Garin, negotiates a detail with the magistrate in low tones. The narrator overhears the terms: extra coin for an added sequence, a public note for the magistrate's ledger. This negotiation is an external event that alters the evening's parameters. Havel returns to the wheel with a new iron bracket. He fits it against the rim and says, "This will hold his spine." It keeps him straight when turned. Garin nods and signs. The narrator documents the bracket's fit and how it will change the pain's geometry. The bracket aligns the torso so that spinal turns transmit force into consciousness instead of producing sudden death. The condemned's jaw tightens. Fear shifts toward a different tone, a wary calculation. He braces as if preparing to count the blows in his head. The second sequence begins and the crowd's breathing becomes a single measured intake. Each blow is an event that resets attention. The narrator maps each hit. First the foot, then the other, each one timed to force the body into an extended wakefulness of agony. "Hold him, Havel," Garin says between strikes. "We need him to stare as they pass the hill," the crowd murmurs. Some call for mercy, others for spectacle. Arguments rise in short bursts. Garin, a guard, says, "You do not have to add the bracket. He will fetch more coins alive than dead." Garin answers, "It's business, sergeant." The magistrate agreed. The guard steps back, fingers on his spear. The exchange is a small confrontation that clarifies motive. Profit and civic theater outweigh mercy. The narrator writes the guard's name down on the margin of his notes as an observer who might later attest to motive. The condemned's voice changes. He is able to spit a phrase now, short and deliberate. "I beg you, Garin," he says, "do not make it spectacle. Do what the law says." Garin looks at him like a man hearing a child's complaint. "The law says what we write it to say." Garin replies, "We make examples." Examples bring order. That line tightens the chapter's moral frame. Order gained through procedural cruelty becomes indistinguishable from appetite. Midway through the night, an unexpected interference arrives. The cleric steps forward and lifts a hand. "Stop a moment." The cleric says, "A confession was recorded. Let him speak before we continue." This is the mandated interruption that acts as a mini cliffhanger. Havel's hammer hovers. The crowd shifts. Garin laughs under his breath, but allows the cleric to approach. The condemned's lucidity returns in that pause. He coughs and forces air through broken teeth. The condemned names a neighbor, then a merchant, then a place where he hid a ledger. The cleric listens and repeats a phrase. The magistrate frowns and stamps a foot. The confession reveals a motive that complicates the earlier assumption. The condemned had kept a ledger showing a local official's miscounts. The magistrate's face goes pale. Havel clears his throat. "This changes little for us," Havel says. "If the ledger proves them corrupt, the town demands the same visibility of punishment." The confession reveals a layer of political self-preservation disguised as justice. Garin and the magistrate exchange harder words now, 3 rapid lines. "You wrote false coin." The magistrate says, "I did not." Garin replies, "Then who signed the record?" The magistrate asks, "You did." Garin counters. The argument is quick and raw. It bends attention from the condemned's pain to a civic quarrel that will determine who is blamed later. The narrator documents the exchange because this dispute will be cited in later depositions. When the wheel turns again, the new bracket catches, and the condemned feels a different kind of pressure through his spine. The sound of bone gives in a sequence Havel and Garin have approved. The turns are slow and ceremonial. The condemned's eyes roll and then focus, then roll again. Consciousness flares in small windows between waves of shock. He mouths a name, martyr, and squeezes the rope where his wrists are bound. A guard loosens not a rope but a muscle. Someone in the crowd cries out because the man called a daughter's name. The execution reaches a technical apex when Havel calls for a tighter wedge. He produces a wedge from his belt and slams it home between ribs to keep the torso aligned. This one will last until dawn, Havel says to Garin. Do it right and the town will talk of it for months, Garin answers. Do it right and the magistrate pays the extra coin. The two men's exchange is cold commerce. The narrator keeps a steady tally of blows, payments, and timing. At the chapter's climax, the wheel is turned fully, and the ritual follows the exact sequence they rehearsed. The condemned's voice is small and spent, but at moments clear. Forgive me, martyr, he whispers. Tell them I never meant harm. The crowd watches, and the boy in the front row drops his toy. The toy skitters down the slope and lands in mud. A woman bends and picks it up, hands it to the child with a look that is both reprimand and apology. The narrator marks that simple action. It becomes an image the town will repeat in testimony. The final strikes come in timed clusters. Havel raises the hammer, Garin counts aloud, and a guard presses his boot into the condemned's chest to steady him. The blows arrive as a sequence of discrete mechanical events. The condemned's breathing shortens and then lengthens. He cries a single name and then falls between consciousness and nothing. The wheel stops. The crowd exhales. The magistrate signs a paper with a shaking hand. The narrator closes his notebook for the first time since the wheel was being readied. Afterward, the foreman orders the wheel cleaned. Garin points and says, "Carry him off." Quietly, Havel lifts a tarp. The narrator records the cleaning process and the exact language used by Garin when he gives the order to the toolsman. Lime, then water. Burn the rope pieces. The ritual ends not with words about mercy but with mechanical cleanup, as if removing blood and mud erases responsibility. In the pre-dawn, people leave with coats pulled tight. The magistrate walks with the clerk, arguing about what to write in the ledger. The condemned's body is carried away, and the narrator watches the bracket discarded in a tool shed with oil and grit still on its face. The cleric tucks his prayer book away and fingers a bead. His mouth remains shut. The boy keeps his toy clutched to his chest. These details remain: a magistrate's signature, a bracket in a shed, a child's toy in wet hands. Before the chapter closes, the narrator notes a concrete shift in local power. Documents emerge later naming Garin as the foreman who insisted on spectacle. Havel's ledger shows the extra coin. The cleric's marginal note records a confession the condemned gave naming a municipal ledger. Each of these concrete items will be used to argue motive and culpability. The chapter ends on a final situational beat. Garin hands the magistrate a sealed envelope with an extra tally, and the magistrate tucks it into his coat with a small, deliberate motion. The hill is emptying as the narrator steps back to record inventory. One bracket, one wheel, one tarpaulin stained and set aside, one child's toy muddy in a pocket. Garin gives the final order aloud. Take it down. The wheel is lowered and dragged toward the shed. The narrator closes his notebook and lists the events that will be attached to the official record. The bracket, Havel's wedge, Garin's orders, the confession, the magistrate's signature. The chapter resolves the night's conflict by tracing each choice to a named actor. The immediate violence has ended. The institutional choices remain on paper, and in the hands of those who signed them. Emotion shifts moved in this sequence. Fear to guarded lucidity to pleading, then to resigned quiet as the mechanical process finished. Those shifts were shown through the condemned's flinches, the way he tried to speak a name, the pause when he addressed the child, and the tightening of his fingers on rope. Garin and Havel shifted from confident performance to a moment of uneasy bargaining when the confession touched the magistrate's name. The cleric moved from habit to intervention and then back to silence. By the final paragraph, the narrator ties the immediate events to the institutional aftermath. A magistrate's ledger will later be used to argue both guilt and cover up, A bracket discarded in a shed will be fingerprinted by an inquisitive clerk. A child's toy will be counted in testimony. The last concrete beat is Garin handing the magistrate the sealed envelope, and the magistrate tucking it into his coat while the wheel is dragged away. The chapter ends with that action. Garin says, "Make sure this is entered as extra fees," and the magistrate replies, "It will be entered, Gerin." The wheel creaks as it moves. The sound is a closing note. The narrator records the exchange and the motion as the final evidence of how spectacle was chosen over law, and the community's face was shaped by that choice. Chapter 2. The blunt wood hit stone twice and the sound hammered through the hut. "You will not break him quickly," the assistant said, voice thin. Fear sat in the condemned's hands. He tightened his fingers on the rope and tried to stop a tremor. The narrator recorded the line, noting fear as the driving force that would shape every choice that night. Fear that the ritual would be prolonged, fear that the crowd would demand spectacle, fear that mercy would be refused. The executioner, called foreman by the village, did not answer. He raised the cudgel again and gripped it like a tradesman readying a familiar tool. The assistant, named Leto by other records, stepped back and said, "Foreman, break the limb that ends life quick. Not that bone where he writhers for hours." The foreman set the cudgel on the slab and began to test weight, swing, and angle with measured motions. Within minutes the team left the hut and moved up the slope. The narrator followed in ink and memory, but the story opened at the hut because the decision made there determined the rest. The choice of which bone to shatter first would set the length of pain. This was the central problem. The foreman understood the crowd. He understood craft. Leto understood shame. They reached the hill as dusk dragged a stickled grey over the crowd. The condemned was already bound to the wheel. His shoulders rubbed raw against the wooden spokes. Earlier, when the wheel turned beneath the condemned's tied shoulders, a foreman had barked, "Hold him steady," and a man in the crowd shoved forward until the rope bit flesh. The memory of that shove remained in the condemned's fingers. He kept reaching for any slack. The narrator noted the detail and recorded the four faces who would decide whether the ritual became spectacle or end. The priest arrived in a patched surplice and walked straight to the wheel. He crouched and placed his palm over the condemned's chest, counted fingers, and muttered lines meant to secure a soul. "Father," timing, the foreman. Watching the slope and the crowd, "Father, you hurry your prayers and they will think me weak." The priest's jaw cut tight, "Foreman." "You hurry the body and you damn the soul," the priest replied. Their exchange laid bare the legitimizing myths that hid cruelty. Sanctified words bound to secular choreography. The foreman stepped back and surveyed the crowd. A man nicknamed Halvard, recorded in the diary of a local scribe, shouted from the slope, "We paid for the spectacle. Do not spare him!" Halvard's chant moved through others like a push of wind. Leto's mouth tightened. He whispered, "This is not what I signed up for," and the foreman answered only by nodding to a specific sequence of strikes practiced across years of executions. The foreman explained the method out loud, in a tone that treated the body like a machine. "First the arm," he said. "Not the head, not the chest. Break the radius and ulna near the elbow. The shoulder will hold the weight. He will not die but will scream. Then the leg, then the ribs. By the time we roll him, he is a study in sound." Leto swallowed and stepped away. The narrator recorded each syllable. The clinical explanation turned technique into ritual. The condemned tried to speak, voice a thin rasp, "Please," he mouthed and managed. Leto, eyes wide, he reached one wrist toward the assistant. The assistant hesitated. The crowd pressed. A boy shoved against the condemned's knee. The foreman signaled a man to hold the wheel steady. Each small movement forced a decision: end his life early or follow the choreography. Leto's hesitation became a fracture in the crew. He, "Foreman, mercy," and the foreman cut him off. "Mercy is for kin. This is for law and spectacle." The priest's hand trembled once over the condemned's chest. The priest mouthed, "God have mercy," then met the foreman's eyes. "Place him so I can say the final words," the priest demanded. The foreman tapped the wheel and motioned the executioner crew into position. When the blows began, the foreman's motion was economical, rehearsed. He raised the cudgel above the condemned's forearm and struck. The first impact sounded like a distant branch snapping. The condemned's body jerked, his fingers unclenched, then clutched the rope again. "Hold him steady." The foreman barked, and the man on the nearest spoke took a knee against the rope until his shoulder burned. That strike did not kill. It shattered bone into splinters that protruded beneath grey skin. A thin, wet sound followed. The crowd leaned forward. The foreman kept count out of habit, but not in voice. He struck the limb twice more, each hit placed to prevent fatal shock and to keep the heart beating enough for sound. The narrator observed motion, counting beats, and recorded that the method relied on exacted restraint. Precise blows, careful avoidance of vital arteries, and the maintenance of respiration. The priest moved closer and began to recite a litany. His voice rose then faltered. "Father, stop your words." Leto, stepping to the priest, "He hears you." "Do not make him hope," the priest snapped. "Do not tell me what makes him ready for God." And the argument threaded through the crowd. A woman called, "Father, finish the rites," and 3 others echoed. The foreman used the noise to mask his next strikes. The crowd's reaction changed the choreography. Halvard pressed forward and shoved a man aside. "More!" he shouted, "make him show us what crime costs." The foreman paused, glancing at the audience as if testing the wind. He then raised the cudgel higher and aimed at the next limb. Leto's hand brushed the condemned's wrist. He lifted his face as if to say sorry and then looked away. The condemned tried to speak again, words slurred. "Leto," he said, clearer. "Leto, get me down." Leto's fingers closed on the rope. He looked at the foreman, then at the priest. The priest's lips moved but did not look at him. The assistant's choice became the chapter's hinge. Step in and force a mercy that would bring the foreman's wrath, or obey the foreman, and watch a man become a study in sound. Leto reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of cloth. He pressed it to the condemned's mouth to catch blood and to give his fingers something to do. He then stepped back. The foreman turned and said, "Hands off, you know your part." Leto did not strike. He had not the nerve. He ducked, pale, and swallowed hard. The narrator watched the assistant's face. For the precise moment the man split between duty and shame. The foreman's pattern became relentless. He began a slow cadence. 3 blows to the arm, pause, 2 to the thigh, pause, 1 to the ribs. Each pause gave the condemned breath and sound, and every sound answered the crowd's hunger. The condemned convulsed between impacts, eyes rolling under lids, mouth foamed. He screamed short bursts. The sound was raw and mechanical. The crowd cheered once, then fell back into chant. At the midpoint, a surprise occurred. A child in the crowd, no older than 12, threw a small wooden toy at the foreman and hit him on the shoulder. The unexpected strike interrupted the rhythm. The foreman swore and spun. Leto seized the moment, leaned in, and in a low voice said, "Take him down now." The foreman spat. "You fool." He raised the cudgel higher. The child had vanished into a press of legs. Halvard shouted, "Throw him off!" And a man tried to pull the child back, not to protect him, but to hide the embarrassment. The foreman used the confusion to land a heavier blow. That heavy blow bent the condemned's arm into a new angle. A wet sound followed. The priest cried out and stepped away, hands covering his mouth. The narrator recorded the sequence in clinical strokes. The child's thrown toy. Leto's low plea. Halvard's command. The heavier blow. The moment functioned as a mini cliffhanger. Would the assistant force the foreman to stop, or would the foreman answer the crowd and grind the ritual darker? The answer arrived in the next breath. Leto lunged forward and grabbed the cudgel from the foreman's hands. Leto's action snapped the slope into motion. The foreman shoved Leto. Leto stumbled and shoved the foreman back. Leto. The condemned croaked, voice shredded, "Leto, please." The foreman shoved Leto again and then laughed, low and rough. "You will not finish what you started." The foreman. A dozen men closed the space between them. A rapid exchange followed. "Let him down," Leto hissed. "Let him down, or I will tell the scribe what you did. You would tell tales." The foreman, "You who cower at a crowd shout." Leto, "I will tell the scribe about the choice you made to blind the chest and spare the heart." The foreman struck for Leto's shoulder. Hands grabbed both men and pulled them apart. The priest shouted, "Enough!" And the crowd fell into a suspicious hush. The foreman returned to the condemned and resumed the ritual. He used 2 men to hold the arm steady, while he applied a wedge and a final strike designed to prevent the limb from functioning. The condemned's voice broke into a thin groan. Leto watched with his jaw clenched and lips white. He could not bring himself to strike the final blow that would end life mercifully. He had tried to save the man and failed. When the sequence reached the ribs, the foreman used the cudgel's edge to press between cartilage and bone, forcing coughs and shorter breaths. The condemned's body bucked and husks of breath escaped. The priest moved back and finally finished his prayer, voice hollow. The crowd began to disperse in ones and twos, some faces satisfied, some turned away before the final images. After the final blow, the foreman went through a practiced cleaning. He set the cudgel on the slab, wiped his hands on his coat, and returned the iron wedge to its box. He studied his hands as if reading a ledger. Leto lingered and then slipped a small token, one of the condemned's frayed collar strips, into his pocket without looking up. The narrator noted the theft as evidence of change. The assistant's small act signaled moral fracture and future consequence. The condemned slumped into a half, sit as the wheel was left upright. Blood had dried in streaks along the wood where ropes had chafed. The priest touched the condemned's forehead and whispered a final benediction that no longer aimed to comfort but to close papers on a body. Leto stepped away toward the hut path, shoulders hunched. He paused at the edge of the slope, took one last look at the wheel, and then walked into the dark between houses. Outside, men and women spoke in low tones. Halvard walked with a stiff pace and quarreled with 2 men about where to drink after the display. The foreman counted coin in his belt and spoke of weather. The condemned made a sound that could not be called a word, and then curled his head against the wood. The narrator closed the chapter by framing the incident as a deliberate system. Choices made in the hut produced suffering on the slope. The crowd's appetite shaped the executioner's hand. The priest's rights legitimized it. The assistant's theft and flight offered a small, concrete sign of moral change. The chapter ended with a single situational beat. Leto's foot caught on a stone as he left the path. He stumbled, righted himself, and kept walking while holding the collar strip in his fist. The wheel remained on the hill, its spokes riven with dried blood and candle wax, waiting for whatever would come next. Chapter 3. They winched the wheel onto the terrace, while the condemned man was dragged forward and strapped into place. Fear sits at the base of his throat and pushes outward with every breath. Fear drives the condemned to curl his fingers around the rope and to test the bindings with an involuntary tug. The narrator notes fear plainly, in his ledger and in his voice. Fear will decide what the condemned can do and what others will force him to endure. The terrace is a scraped slab of limestone behind the chapel. The foreman, referred to in the records as the executioner, gives 2 clipped orders. The assistant hauls the mallet free, checks its leather grip, and kneels beside the wheel. The magistrate watches from his dais with a ledger open on his knee. The conflict is set. Civic authority poised against ritual procedure, and the condemned trapped between them. The narrator steps back from the rail and ticks items into a margin. He records names, times, and the specific choice the executioner made to prolong suffering. The narrator speaks in the third person and keeps the register clinical. He notes that earlier the wheel had already been turned once under the man's shoulders in a different village procession. A fact listed in the constable's report and referenced tonight by a young townsman in the crowd. The assistant raises the mallet. The first swing is not a surprise, it is a practiced motion. The mallet meets bone. The sound is blunt and precise, measured against the stone like a ruler. The condemned tries to draw breath between strikes and cannot. He grips the rope until his knuckles bloom white. Hold him steady. The executioner orders, now strike 2 in the thigh. Executioner, the magistrate calls. We agreed a shorter end. Records will not pardon spectacle. Magistrate, the executioner answers. The right is the law here. The wheel must speak in the right sequence. They trade those lines in quick succession. The voices are short, each sentence a decision. The magistrate taps his ledger. The executioner watches the condemned like a man reading the pulse of a clock. The assistant falters, then hits again. The crowd leans forward on the slope and presses into the sun. Emotion shifts appear in small actions. Initially, the assistant's hesitation carries doubt. His hand lingers, breath held. His knuckles whiten on the mallet handle. That doubt becomes fear as the executioner seizes his arm and barks a correction. Later, the assistant's reluctance narrows into resignation when the executioner drags him back into rhythm. The condemned moves through fear into a stunned acceptance, when each correct strike follows the prescribed order and keeps him conscious. The narrator writes the sequence. Forearm, thigh, shin, shoulder. He annotates the intervals, the choice to avoid shattering the chest early, the selection of bones that bleed but do not end the heart. He cites a medical tract pinned in municipal files, an account by a barber, surgeon who taught executioners how to break without killing outright. The magistrate taps the ledger open to that page and points with his finger. This is known. The magistrate tells the executioner, "It is what we do," the executioner replies. The condemned cries out between blows, sound cut to a raw animal edge. He never speaks a long sentence. He calls one name once, mother, then collapses again into breathing that rattles through his ribs. The narrator records the cry without commentary, then moves on to list which joint failed first and which held. An external event arrives. A townsman bumps into the railing and drops his wooden flask. Metal skitters and a small knot of voices rises. The assistant freezes for a fraction longer than before. The executioner turns his head for a beat, just long enough to let a trickle of daylight glance off the mallet's face. That glance becomes part of the record. It is where the assistant misaims, yielding a soft mercy. The assistant misses intentionally. The mallet strikes leather and misses bone by the width of a thumb. The condemned twists his head, tasting copper. For a heartbeat, the audience holds its breath. For a heartbeat, mercy threads through the terrace like a thin rope. The executioner's hand clamps down on the assistant's shoulder and drags him back to the prescribed rhythm. You shirk like a slave. The executioner hisses, "Forgive me." The assistant says, "Strike true," the executioner orders. That exchange is blunt. It reveals the first twist. The assistant's hesitation is not fear of punishment, but a private mercy born of recollection. The narrator later will write that the assistant had once watched his own brother die in a tapping of bone. The crowd does not know that. Only the assistant's hands betray him. Tension rises as the magistrate attempts to intervene. He stands, ledger clutched, and calls again for a shorter end. He is not a sympathetic figure in voice or manner. He is a civic man who fears scandal more than the sound of bone. He calculates the political consequence of footage in public memory. Magistrate, the executioner answers without turning his head. You will not rewrite the right. You risk a riot, the magistrate snaps, or a precedent, magistrate. The executioner says, precedent, keeps the wheel in the hands of men like me, the back, and fourth escalates into rapid lines. 3, then 4 short sentences, the argument narrowing into a contest of who governs suffering. The magistrate's voice is edged with calculation. The executioner's is edged with ritual authority. Nearby, the assistant wipes sweat from his lip. He breathes through the sequence like a man performing a labor, not a punishment. The condemned, between whimpers, hears the exchange as the last humiliation. Even his death is contested like property. Another event punctuates the midsection. A child in the crowd vomits, and two people move away. The movement shifts a small pocket of light on the terrace, revealing a fresh bruise at the condemned's temple. The narrator notes the bruise in his ledger and connects it to the previous village's procession. He references the earlier report, where the wheel had turned under his shoulders and another man had shouted words that would not be repeated here. This reference reframes the condemned's current state, not a single punishment but the accumulation of public spectacles. Dialogue again carries information. The assistant mutters, "He already had a wound. I saw it in the constable's note." The magistrate says, "See it now." The executioner replies. Each short line confirms evidence, shifts understanding. The magistrate's insistence that the trial be quick starts to look less like mercy and more like expedience. The executioner's insistence on ritual begins to look like a claim to professional control. The audience changes position, slowly, in their minds. The build continues. The executioner calls for a specific sequence of strikes drawn from manuals. Limb first, then torso last if needed. The assistant sets his feet and delivers blow after blow. The condemned's body reacts in discrete ways. A convulsion in the right leg, a ragged intake of breath, fingers that release the rope and grip it again. The narrator records each micro-reaction as if charting a patient. At the chapter's midpoint, a mini-cliffhanger appears. The executioner lifts the mallet for a blow that would either destroy the condemned's ability to cry or finally end a pulse. He pauses, looking into the man's face. The crowd leans in. The narrator writes, "The decision at this strike will determine whether the ritual succeeds as law or collapses into brutality." The mallet falls. The blow does not land where the executioner intended. The assistant, in a sudden motion, jerks the rope and shifts the condemned's torso. The mallet cracks bone in the wrong place. The condemned screams in a way that rings with surprise rather than resignation. The executioner explodes in anger and shoves the assistant clear. "You moved him." The executioner spits. "He flinched," the assistant says. The executioner hauls the assistant to his feet and strikes his hand with the mallet as punishment for the mistake. The magistrate stands and slaps the ledger down so hard the pen bounces. "Enough," the magistrate says. "Not enough," the executioner answers. Ritual must not bend to trembling hands. This quarrel redefines power in public. The magistrate aims at limiting spectacle. The executioner aims at preserving authority through precise cruelty. The assistant sits in between, bearing both the psychic weight of what he has seen and the physical mark of being struck by the executioner. The climax arrives in slow sequences of action. The executioner regains control and resumes the ordered strikes, but now his blows carry a punitive edge. He chooses bones that prolong consciousness, working with a knowledge of human anatomy that reads like a manual. Break the radius but leave the elbow. Crush the tibia but keep the chest intact. Each choice is cold and procedural. The assistant carries out the strikes like a man whose hands will not forgive him. Strike the limb. The executioner counts. "On the thigh, executioner," the assistant replies. A series of blows follows. The condemned's body convulses, then goes limp, then convulses again. The crowd's murmurs turn to a low chant that dies when the blows stop. The executioner stops only when his list is complete. He steps back, mallet in hand, and looks at the magistrate. The magistrate opens his ledger and writes a single line. He records time and the names of officials present. He makes annotations about witness behavior, the crowd count, and whether the right maintained dignity. The executioner watches him as if waiting for validation. The assistant sinks to his knees and vomits into a leather cup behind the wheel. After the blows end, a different set of external events takes place. Town clerks come forward to affix seals. A scribe reads aloud a passage from the municipal code that justifies the procedure. People begin to move away from the terrace, clutching their cloaks. A woman stops at the base of the stairs and presses both palms to her mouth. The narrator concludes the chapter with a cataloging of immediate aftermath. The executioner wipes the mallet on old cloth. The assistant rubs his hands with straw and refuses the magistrate's offered wine. The magistrate closes his ledger, hinges a seal, and commands the bailiff to prepare the transport to the common table where the body will be displayed per statute. Emotion shifts have transpired across the chapter. Doubt to fear in the assistant, fear to resignation in the condemned, professional pride to rage in the executioner, calculation to uneasy compromise in the magistrate. Those shifts are shown in precise actions: a missed strike, a snapped ledger, a vomit, a sealed page. A surprise moment follows the climax. The scribe, a secondary figure who had been taking notes in the back, pulls the magistrate aside and slides a folded scrap across the ledger. The scrap contains an annotation from another town's clerk that names the executioner in an old scandal. A case where a different magistrate had tried to shorten a rite and been overruled. The scrap changes how the magistrate reads his own ledger. He hesitates, fingers hovering over the seal. Magistrate. The scribe says, "You should see this." The magistrate's hand goes still. He reads, then looks up at the executioner. For an instant, the balance of power shifts on the terrace. It is a small revelation with a concrete effect. The magistrate will delay his sealing long enough to ask questions tomorrow. The chapter ends with final, concrete actions that ground closure. The executioner begins to clean the wheel with a stiff brush. The assistant sits at the edge of the terrace and pulls his boots off slowly. The condemned, now bound and broken, is lifted by two bailiffs and carried down the slope toward the display table. The narrator lingers in his notes and records the time of departure. The last line is a physical beat. The magistrate slams the ledger closed and taps the seal with quick fingers, then looks at the executioner and says, "Record the order and leave the wheel." The executioner nods, and men begin to move the wheel off the terrace toward the shed where it will wait for the next citation. The noise of their boots on stone becomes the final sound of the chapter. The record will remain, written in the narrator's hand, of which bones were broken and which were left. The assistant will return to his work but carry a new scar on his palm. The magistrate will sleep badly and question a decision he thought procedural. The executioner will teach another apprentice the list of strikes and why timing matters. These are the concrete consequences the narrator files before the chapter closes. The chapter's emotional root, fear, has governed choices and reactions from the opening rope tug to the final sealing of the ledger. The story closes on a specific situational note. The bailiffs carry the condemned down the slope, and the magistrate signals a clerk to delay the formal seal until morning, placing a deliberate hold on the final public record. That hold is a precise action that ties to every dispute we witnessed, and it leaves the reader with one concrete thing to follow into the next chapter. Chapter 4. The wheel began to turn as the foreman barked for order, and the club rose for its first deliberate strike. Fear is immediate in the condemned man's hands. It drives his grip on the rope and shapes every small motion he still controls. The narrator notes that fear, and not vengeance, directs the procedure now because the ritual must teach. The crowd leans forward as dusk pulls shade across the hill. The first blow lands with a dry report. Bone speaks before the crowd does. He is 35 and gaunt. The condemned wears ragged linen. His wrists are bound with wooden fetters. He tests the rope with a pull, and the rope creaks. That specific motion, fingers clenching, thumb pressing into frayed hemp, appears in the records cited by the narrator and will be referenced again by witnesses. This concrete detail ties back to earlier entries. The wheel had been winched into place and the man had been strapped there, while the foreman barked orders in a voice the witnesses recorded as flat and precise. Foreman Garin steps back and lifts the club again. Assistant Thomas stands with his hand on the club handle, waiting for Garin's count. Magistrate Rolf watches from the slope and does not blink. The crowd hushes. The narrator marks the choreography. Command, strike, pause, assessment. The pause is part of the punishment. It stretches pain into time. Hold him steady. Garin orders, hold him steady. Thomas repeats, palms whitening on wood. The condemned breathes shallow. He says nothing. He mouthed a name once 2 days before, an ordinary name that belongs to a baker's daughter, and that surfaces now as a human detail, not a plea. The assistant watches that movement. Thomas's jaw moves, his shoulders dip once, then straighten. The assistant is not a blank instrument. He is a man who will change the pattern by hesitating. The narrator records each cue with the same low cadence he uses when listing dates. He catalogues the sound of club on bone, the way the wheel spins, the blood's dark smear on the wood. He does not moralize, he lists. The listing itself becomes evidence. They space the strikes. Garin times them to produce the longest moment of agony that will not kill immediately. He listens for joints grinding under blunt force, watches for tendons that turn to slack, and instructs Thomas on the precise arc to avoid early death. Aim higher, Thomas. Leave the thigh. Break the arm later. Let the crowd learn how long a man can cry. Garin says. His voice is steady. There is a clerk's precision in it. Thomas moves on Garin's count. He hits. The condemned convulses and inhales a sharp, ragged breath. A pebble dislodged from the terrace rolls down the slope and clacks against a post. The crowd reacts with an animal sound, a low intake of breath that both punishes and fuels the spectacle. Emotion shifts begin in small acts. First, fear hardens into panic in the condemned's fingers. He pulls at the rope and tests the fetters as if searching for a flaw he can exploit. Then the assistant trembles between fear and pity. His hands shake visibly when he raises the club. Later, guilt will press his shoulders down like a weight. Those shifts are recorded not as labels but as observable changes. Trembling hands, an involuntary step back, a swallowed word. The narrator notes these motions in short sentences, and the witnesses corroborate them. A magistrate's presence alters technique. When Magistrate Rolf steps forward onto the slope, he points at the assembly and speaks with a civic flatness. Make the lesson last, he says, make it plain. He names the purpose aloud. The foreman answers with a nod. His face does not change. The assistant's fingers whiten on the club. The ruler's order converts private cruelty into public policy. One official gesture, and the ritual needs to be prolonged not merely to punish a crime, but to instill obedience. Thomas hesitates on a later strike when the condemned makes a motion that almost resembles speech. The man's lips form 2 words, my wife, so soft the crowd cannot hear. Thomas freezes. Garin snaps at him and slaps his palm aside. That slap is sharp enough to create a second of sound that steals attention from bone and breath. The assistant's face flushes. He raises the club again, but the hesitation stays in his hands. That brief mercy and its punishment is a turning point. It shows that the ritual is brittle. It can be bent by pity for a second and then punished for that bending. Thomas's hesitation leads to a harsher sequence. Garin reasserts control with an abrupt set of blows meant to both punish the condemned and to correct the assistant. The blows sound different, harder, fewer, targeted to shatter rather than to teach. The crowd exhales a noise that is equal parts relief and approval. A scribe named Henrik moves along the terrace edge, taking notes. He writes not in sentiment but in measures. Time between strikes, number of blows, reactions of the body noted. He says aloud once, and the clerk beside him nods. Henrik's pen pauses when the condemned claws at his face, and then falls silent. Later those notes will be read by men in offices and used to justify the procedure. For now, the pen stop is a physical action that becomes a recorded gap. A new revelation emerges when the narrator uncovers a civic purpose beneath the spectacle. Officials set rules for the performance. Strike intervals, which limbs to avoid breaking early, when to change the angle so death does not come too soon. The scribe proves this by holding up a sheet and reading aloud a passage that lists parameters. Interval must not be fewer than 2 breaths, Henrik reads. Strike sequence must alternate limbs so that collapse is delayed. The words on the sheet are not sympathy. They are method. An outside event rattles the sequence. A boy in the crowd shouts that his sister watched a man survive 3 days on the wheel in a town to the north. That shout feeds the crowd's appetite. People argue. The magistrate furrows and points at the boy. Silence, he says. The boy goes quiet, but the information has been launched into the slope. The knowledge that survival is possible stretches the ritual's meaning. It is not only execution, it is testing endurance. The foreman hears this and shifts technique to ensure the experiment produces predictable results. The condemned tries to speak after a set of strikes and instead vomits bile. He presses his lips together and breathes shallow. His knees jerk under the straps. He looks at Thomas. Thomas, he rasps, and that single use of the assistant's name sears through the crowd's distance. Thomas blinks. The assistant looks older suddenly. He steps closer and then steps back. That hesitation spawns a debate among the men on the terrace. Confrontation erupts. Garin and Thomas exchange words in a rapid back and forth. Thomas strike on 3. Garin orders. Garin, he begged. Thomas answers. Begging is why we are here. Garin replies, I can. Thomas starts. You can. Garin snaps. They trade 5 short lines in under 10 seconds. The rhythm of those lines speeds the scene. The assistant's voice is thin. Garin's is blunt. Their words are sharp tools that rearrange power in front of the crowd. That argument contains both a command and a correction. It ends when Thomas takes the club and hits. The crowd registers each exchange. The scribe writes the argument down as a line item because debates are part of the ritual record. The magistrate chooses not to intervene. He allows the foreman to enforce order. The choice to let one man correct another becomes a civic lesson. Discipline will be internalized by the officials and the populace. Late in the ritual, Henrik reports a detail that rewrites how the crowd understands what they are seeing. He reads a phrase from a ledger. Procedures adopted to measure endurance may be adapted for deterring unrest. The phrase is dry, but the meaning lands like a stone. The wheel is not merely punishment. It is an engineered demonstration of authority. Faces tighten in the crowd. Some shift away, others lean in. Emotion shifts again. Piercing fear in the condemned settles into a ragged resignation. Thomas's initial pity curdles into shame that presses his shoulders down. Garin's clinical focus does not change, but his hands begin to move with a steadier rhythm that suggests years of repetition. The narrator notes these changes in measured syllables and short clauses. Fled panic, trimmer to shame, methodical steel. An unexpected reveal occurs when a spectator stands and calls attention to a mark on Garin's forearm. You carry the brand of the watch, the spectator shouts. The voice is female and cracked with age. You were on the council last winter when they wrote the ordinance. Garin glances at the woman, then at the magistrate. Rolf's jaw tightens. The accusation implies a link between the law and the personal enforcement. That link reframes Garin's role. He is not just an executioner but an agent of policy. The crowd murmurs. Thomas hears the murmur and steps back. He is suddenly aware that his hands are not merely tools. They are instruments of a rule he had been taught to accept. The assistant's anonymity cracks. He looks toward the magistrate, then at Garin, then down at the club. He feels exposed. That exposure forces a choice. Continue as instrument or turn away. A mini cliffhanger arrives when Thomas mid-swing and under Garin's stare loosens his grip. The club slips a fraction and the swing almost misses its mark. Time compresses. The crowd inhales. Garin's eyes flash. Hold on, he says, the single word slicing the slope into 2 moments. The narrator freezes that second and lists the physical signs. Thomas's hands slipping, Garin's eyeball narrowing, the condemned's head lolling. The assistant does not drop the club, but the near miss becomes a pivot where the audience wonders whether the ritual will break. Garin regains control by striking with a set meant to recalibrate. He swings low and deliberate. The blow fractures bone cleanly enough to end the man's ability to regain equilibrium. The condemned convulses and his shoulders go slack. The crowd emits a collective sound that is almost relieved. The magistrate nods as if a rule has been validated. The narrator records the end with the same calm cadence used at the opening: date, time, action. Yet the climax is more than death. It is the collective letdown, the precise moment when pain ceases and civic routine resumes. Garin steps forward, checks the man for pulse in a mechanical way, and announces a single line. Done. That line is the chapter's apex. It is spoken by the man who choreographed the suffering, and it is a word that changes the slope's air. The crowd shifts from witness to participant as the officials give orders to remove the body. After the final strike, the scribe closes his book slowly and tucks the quill behind his ear. Henrik speaks to Magistrate Rolf in a low voice, and the magistrate nods. They arrange disposal: a cart, the grave beneath the yew, a record to be filed. The assistant is silent. Garin wipes his hands on the inside of his coat in a movement that is not neat. It is necessary. The aftermath is procedural. A clerk orders the wheel to be cleaned and stored. Men lift the condemned onto a rough sled. Tumas follows at a distance. He steps into the moonlight and pauses, looking back at the wheel. The wheel glints under the pale light and then becomes a dull black object in the mud. The narrator describes that object with factual terms: iron hoops, fresh sap in the ropes, dried blood in the crevices. These are details that fix reality, not metaphors. Before the cart leaves, Garin speaks to Thomas in a low voice. "Never hesitate where the law is clear," he says. Thomas answers, "I did hesitate." He touches his palm to his mouth and wipes with the heel of his hand. "Then learn why," Garin replies. Henrik murmurs aloud enough for Thomas to hear. "The record will say you followed orders. It will not say your hands trembled." The scribe's remark is both shield and indictment. Thomas' face tightens. He returns to the wheel, feels the grain of the wood, and lays a hand on the spokes, as if testing their weight. That tactile action is a small confession. The final lines of the chapter are made of orders. Magistrate Rolf tells the clerks to file the ledger, to note interval and strikes, to keep the names. He tells the crowd that law was served. The crowd disperses in groups, carrying the night's image home for its own uses. Thomas walks away with his hands empty but marked. Garin resumes the posture of duty. Henrik tucks the ledger under his arm and moves toward the magistrate's carriage. The narrator records each motion with the same steady voice he held through the wheel's turning. A small, concrete event closes the chapter. As the cart creaks down the slope, a boy from the crowd reaches into his satchel and pulls slow a torn scrap of bread. He tosses it at the wheel and it lands among the spokes. The crumb is tossed not as pity, but as an unconsidered action that registers with Thomas. Thomas bends, retrieves the bread, and drops it into the cart beside the body. He does not speak. This small act resolves a private element of the scene. A man who hesitated chose a minor kindness that will never be recorded, but that alters how he walks out of the hill. The narrator's final line is a precise, situational beat. He notes the cart's wheel hitting a rut and the leather strap on the harness snapping as the men adjust. The snap is an action that ends the chapter on a physical note. Officials give terse instructions. The wheel sits half, buried in mud under a cold moon. The slope returns to the quiet of property lines and farm tracks. The story's immediate conflict, how the ritual enforces power through calibrated cruelty, has been enacted, contested, and resolved in the actions of Garin, Thomas, Henrik, and Magistrate Rolf. The chapter concludes with orders spoken and a body removed, and with Thomas' hand empty but no longer steady.